Okay, we are on. Is that good? There. All right. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders, named Jairus, came, and when he said Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized the power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. And then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell to his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, and for the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion, with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him, and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, Titha koum, which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this, and told them to give her something to eat.
All right, thank you. One of my favorite passages today. All right, well, I had asked you guys if you'd started your holiday shopping yet. And some people, they start their holiday shopping, in like June, I mean, like they are like on it with things. I try to plan ahead like that. I'm not so great, but you can grab that first slide. It was yesterday, two different stores that I walked into. This was really annoying for me. I walked in and there weren't prices. Are you guys noticing that? That in some aisles they're not pricing like seasonal items. And I was like, well, and it even said like, oh, like whatever is from this brand is going to be 40% off, but like nothing, it wasn't whatever. I just grabbed a picture of a store. I didn't take a picture of a store, but that's not where it was. Just so that I'm not revealing the businesses, but I was really annoyed and I was like, how much is this? So as I was going through the store and I was looking at things, if it didn't have a price, I thought it was amusing. I checked it. If it didn't have a price, immediately what happened in my brain was the question of, is this worth tracking a store person down to ask? You know what I'm saying? Like that's kind of a hassle. That's a bother. And immediately I thought, I'm not even going to ask somebody, like, could you scan this and tell me what, because the store didn't have those little scanny thingies on the pillars, which also, like, how many of you guys actually go over and use those things? I don't, because that's just more work. Like, I don't want it to be work for me. I'm a very lazy shopper. So I was automatically realizing that I was starting a value system of something, if it was even worth finding out the cost. And then there was like one item I thought, that's actually kind of cool. I'm going to ask a person. And they scanned it. And I was like, could you tell me what this costs? And she scanned it and let me know. And I was like, how come things aren't being priced around here? And she said, well, a lot of times the seasonal items will end up having a fluxing price. Like the price of this item is going to change multiple times between now and Christmas. And I was annoyed by that, like very much annoyed. I'm okay with when they price it and then they decide to change the price and there's those little sheets saying like, if it was $15, it's now this, because they can just swap that one little card out, right? But because there's not like a designated set price for the holiday season in some stores for some of their items, they're just not even having the employees bother pricing them. But now the poor employees have to deal with everybody asking how much everything costs in the store. And so, like, not knowing the value of something made me start to gauge a value in my head right off the bat, on whether or not I thought it was worth it, if it was worth the hassle, which before, that was never even a factor for me, trying to decide if something was of value to me. So go ahead and grab that next slide. So the question is value really in the eye of the beholder, or is it absolute? Think about that for a second. Is value in the eye of the beholder, or is it an absolute? And there's two things about this, and that's when they say, like, oh, beauty's in the eye of the beholder, right? To somebody, it's beautiful. To somebody else, it's not. The value of something, you could say it is definitely worth this much, but it could have sentimental value to another person, right? Like, there's a story attached to it, so now it's worth more, but it's only worth more to that particular person. But when you really get down to it, does the object have an absolute value? And when we think about, is there absolute value? I think of Pilate when he's talking with Jesus, and he asks Jesus the question, what is truth? And we ponder the question, is there such thing as absolute truth? Right? Is there absolute truth? And if there is absolute truth, then yes, we may have our own opinions and our own thoughts, but there's still absolute truth. There's still absolute truth. Is there absolute value, though? Is there such thing as absolute value? And we're going to look at that today. Is there really absolute value, or is value, whatever works for you, if it's sentimental or not, if it's worth tracking down a store clerk? My grandmother, when shopping, would be like, oh my gosh, that's so cute. And then she'd look at the price tag and she'd say, well, it's not that cute. You know what I mean? Like, that ranged how cute she really thought something was. I don't know how many times my grandmother said that in a store, but she was on her own gauge. She wasn't looking for absolute value. And here's the craziest thing is, we are playing with this question all the time. So we're doing a series right now on go. We're looking at the Great Commission, and that when Jesus calls his disciples together and he commissions them to go out and spread the gospel, it tells us that some of them doubted. But Jesus commissioned them anyway. He uses you wherever you're at in your faith, wherever you're at. He uses you. And this word go, therefore go make disciples. He starts out saying, like, all authority has been given to me. Like, there's absolute truth. There's absolute authority. It's all been given to me, and he's a good and loving God who wants everyone to know that they're loved and that forgiveness is right there. Right? And he sends people out. This go is in the ongoing tense in the Greek. So it means as you are going. And so we've been talking about this. As you are going, make disciples. And what does that look like? And so we've looked at Philip, right? As Philip was going in the book of Acts, he goes from Jerusalem up to Samaria. And we looked at the map. He literally just wants to cross over to the coast. But God tells him to get back down to Jerusalem and then start taking this other path, because he was to run into the Ethiopian eunuch. And when he runs into that guy, he shares the gospel with that guy. Remember that? And then after this, Philip has to make this whole big trek back up. And that sometimes when God calls us to go, it's going to be out of the way. Sometimes the go is a detour and it's out of the way for us. Jacob and I had a go this week that was out of the way. We spontaneously went out of our way to go bless somebody, to go bless a family. And so sometimes that go is an out of the way journey. And so God likes to just step in and say, I know what your plans are, but here are mine. Then we looked at the Good Samaritan, that as the Samaritan was going in this parable, there was a gentleman who was hurt, and who knows what the Samaritan's plans were, but he stopped to care for this man at his own expense and get him to an inn, and then come back to check on him and settle whatever more costs were involved in that. But that going has nothing to do with who that person is that you're coming to help. It has to do with who you are. So that's the thing. When we looked at the Good Samaritan, remember that? The Good Samaritan, the dude who gets beat up is bleeding, and the priest and the Levite pass him up, right? Because they're like, oh, we can't be around blood or death because we'll be considered unclean, and then we can't continue on with our lives. And so due to who that person was and their condition, they decided to pass. But when the Samaritan showed up, it didn't matter that the guy was beat up, bleeding, and dying. The Samaritan knew who he was. And so he stopped for them. And that we need to remember that when we are to go, we don't judge that person that we are going to. It has nothing to do with them. Do you love Jesus? And are you walking with him? And if that is who you are, you stop, regardless of what social class they belong to. Remember, Jesus launches into that whole thing because a guy challenges him and says, well, technically, who's my neighbor? And Jesus tells the Good Samaritan, and when he wraps it up, he says, who was a neighbor to that man? Because the question is not who's your neighbor. The question is, are you being a neighbor? Are you going and being a neighbor as you go, like what the Samaritan did? And then last week, we looked at the 72. Jesus sent out the 72 and was all, go into these villages and find the house of peace and share the gospel. Find the house of peace. And we talked about how we don't really live in a culture where you're just going to randomly go out and do that, right? And go stay in some person's home. In other nations, that kind of hospitality is not odd to them, that you'd show up and then they would offer to let you stay the night. That actually does function in this day and age in other countries, but in America, maybe not so much. However, you do realize that all week you cross paths with houses of peace, right? Because the house of peace is the person. It is. You stood in line, maybe at the post office or the grocery store, and there was a house of peace behind you and a house of peace in front of you. And did you pray for an opportunity there? So sometimes the opportunity, I don't mean you just be some person who's like super awkward, who just tries to talk to every single stranger, and have some measure of just asking God, are you guiding me to speak right now? Because the crazy thing is, he guides us to speak actually pretty often, but we miss it because we've already decided he wouldn't ask this of us. How many of you guys have ever had an encounter with somebody and it changed your life? We're looking at that today, what that encounter looks like. And so we're looking at one of my absolute most favorite stories, and I'm gonna read through some of it again, and we're gonna take some little pauses and have a little bit of discussion as we go. So when Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, my little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live. And so Jesus went with him. Y'all remember the story where the guy comes and he's like, hey, my servant, the centurion's like, my servant needs healing. And he's like, but I know that you can heal him from here. And Jesus is like, yeah, I can. Love the faith. Notice here, Jesus doesn't stop and lecture this guy. He doesn't turn around and be like, oh, you want me to go all the way out of my way to go see your kid who's sick? Do you realize I could just heal her from here? No, he doesn't do that. He doesn't give the guy any bit. The guy sought him out and made a request, and Jesus decides to go with him. And I think it's because he knows he's going to run into the next lady. Like, along the way, right? This is going to be the one moment that we see Jesus out walking and he stops right there. And it looks like, it was an unplanned situation. But just by the fact that Jesus is going, and he didn't need to, shows you that he knew who was going to be in that crowd that day. He knew who he was running into. A large crowd followed and pressed around him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She'd suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors, and it's been all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. Can you grab the slide with the picture there? Your Bible might say that she reached out to touch his fringe. And that's closer to translation. So Jesus is a rabbi, so he would have had a rabbinic shawl that would have some different tassels on it. There was this big fat main tassel. It was a prayer tassel, and when it says that she reached out to try to touch his fringe, it's indicating with that it is like this is this gal's last prayer. Like this is her last hope, her last prayer, and she's reaching out. She's not just touching any random part of his cloak. She's reaching for that prayer tassel, right? How incredible is that? And it's not that she thinks it's just magical, because she thought, if I could just touch his clothes, I will be healed. It's that they're on him. Like he is the miracle. And where she's reaching for, right? It's still something that she's trying to be very unnoticed, right? For good reason here, we'll talk about. Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. So her healing was immediate. And there's times when we do see this in Scripture. There's times we still see this to this day, but healing is immediate. Other times we see healing in the form of there's the dude that Jesus heals a blindness, but he heals him, and then he heals him again, because the guy can partially see after one bit. And we always love to have those little theological talks about, well, why did Jesus half heal him and then finish healing him in a span of what could possibly be maybe 2 minutes, right? We see that when God moves, he doesn't just always work the exact same way every single time, right? He's meeting people where they're at, because God is always up to more than just the physical healing. Every time, he's up to more than just the request of the physical healing. So when we are praying for physical healing, we should also be praying for all of the vast parts that go around that, right? There's so many pieces that also happen that surround that. And probably a big piece is you start to question your own value. Have you ever been so sick and wondered why you weren't well, and then started wondering if you mattered to God? And that he probably only heals those he loves or those he cares about. It's interesting how whenever we go through some range of suffering, we start to question our own value. As we go through any kind of struggle that we walk through, our value becomes the question at that point. And believe me, Jesus is totally aware that we do that we question our value. And the crazy thing is, if you believe in absolute truth, you got to believe in some absolute value, because those two are connected, right? Absolute truth and absolute value are connected, because within truth, value is declared. And if it's absolute, you guys, then nothing in this world can take that value away. Nothing can diminish you and decide you're worth anything less. Nothing. There's nothing that you can do to bring your own value down. But sometimes we go through hard things and we think it's a reflection of our value to God. Just the same way when somebody treats us a certain way, we think, I don't think I matter to that person. Look at how they've treated me or forgotten me or whatever it is. We will gauge our value based on how people are treating us. And so we're in that flux of questioning it. But when we really grab onto that absolute truth of who Jesus is, who God is declaring we are to him, then an absolute value has been declared. And no way anyone ever treats you can change that. And when we suffer, it's also not a declaration that we're worth less. It means that we're in the journey to understanding how much we really are worth a lot of the time here. So let's take a moment and look at her. So she has been bleeding 12 years. Just within that, she is considered a societal outcast because she's bleeding. So she's a societal outcast. She would have been considered unclean. So this is another round of a scene that, as we talk about going, the two gentlemen wouldn't stop for the guy who'd been beat up because he was bleeding and possibly dying. So they didn't want to become unclean and deal with him. So this woman being declared unclean, it means that she is not allowed to be within the society, and she would have, if she walked into town, she'd have to be like yelling, unclean, unclean, which would just be so humiliating, so embarrassing, right? And then also, if she's been cast out there, like her value societally would go down because she can't like have a family, right? And in this time, like women were expected to have babies, and if she's constantly bleeding, she's not going to be able to have a baby. So her value goes down as a wife, right? So who knows what happened in that narrative of her with her own family, but her value as a woman would have gone down in society for that because she can't have children like expected. And so also society would have assumed that it was punishment. They would have assumed she must have done something wrong. You know, so many times Jesus has healed people and he will tag on. He does this with the guy who gets lowered through the roof. He does this with the guy of Bethsaida, and then he does it with the adulterous woman. He said, now go and sin no more. And he's like, don't continue. He doesn't do that to this lady. There's also the blind guy, remember? And like the disciples are like, so who sinned that this guy is blind, him or his parents? You know what I mean? Like everybody wants to believe that if you have an ailment of some kind, it's because of your sin. And so naturally, that would have been assumed about this woman. But in this case, like Jesus didn't add that on, which means that when Jesus adds that on, it's separate from the fact that the person was sick, right? It's separate from the fact that the person was an invalid or the person was blind. It's separate from that, honestly, because otherwise Jesus would have said that every single time he healed somebody. But we know that we have a God who wants to heal the whole person. So there's the physical ailment, but then sometimes we also have a sin lifestyle we're struggling with, and God wants to have that healed too. And with this woman, another area of healing for her besides the physical was her social standing, because he stops and he gives her time. You guys, that is a big deal that he stops to give her time. So she's really in a place where no one is giving her time at all. And she really is alone to a very large extent. And also, like, here's this part where it says that she's been suffering under these doctors. So and it's not like she had medical insurance, right? She had to pay cash, and she was out of cash. And you wonder, like, doesn't she have people who care enough to pick up the bill? Maybe she had people who cared that much, but they didn't have the funds to pick up the bill. Or she had people in her life who just had, on their own side, given up hope. And society would have just decided, well, she's probably a guilty person, so this has nothing to do with the doctors anymore. But how many of you have ever had that hard part where you went to the doctors and things just got worse? Things just got worse. And sometimes doctors do make huge errors. And other times doctors are just not able to heal. And so she's just in a place where her suffering has increased, and she is at a point where there's no more hope. But then there's Jesus, the miracle worker, and he is passing through. He's passing through. And so she's just got to get in there. She's just got to get in there. However, that means she has to get into town and hope she's not recognized. She has no business being in there amongst everybody, right? That like at that point, anyone who bumped into her and touched her, this is a tight crowd. Also, isn't it funny how this story, everybody makes fun of Jesus to some degree? Like the disciples were like, someone touched you? Everyone's touching you. We're all pressed in together, you know? Everyone being in that tight little area, had they realized that an unclean person was in there, they would all be declared unclean if they had touched her, because they feel like they were contaminated for touching her. She had no business being there. Society had no business. There's no room for her in any of that. So we'll keep going here. At once, Jesus realized that the power had gone out of him, and he turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched me? Who touched me?" And the disciples laugh at him a little bit here. And they're like, what do you mean there's a crowd pressing on you? And yet you ask who touched me? But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Think for a second about how there was like this multitude of people pressing up against Jesus. And his power did not go out to any of them. But only one person, because one person reached out for him with a measure of faith, that measure of saying, like, I know the truth and you're it. I mean, we do realize the disciples haven't fully realized who Jesus is as of yet. It actually, they don't really quite come to the fullness of who Jesus is until after he's resurrected and he gives them the Holy Spirit, right? So we have to remember that they're still like, who is this rabbi we follow? Oh my goodness. You know what I mean? He actually had just calmed the storm just before this, and they're all shocked that the wind and the waves followed him. Like, they're shocked by that. They're shocked by that because they are still learning who he is. But this gal, she knows who he is. She hasn't connected that absolute truth and absolute value have a connection. She's not sure about her value because she's allowed society to decide her value. But she knows who he is. And so of all the people pressing in around Jesus, one person gets healed in that. Because one person has really grasped onto who he really, really is. And then I love this part. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. Or your Bible might have says, told her whole story. Told her whole story. And she's terrified. Like, she fesses up right away and tells her whole story. Why would she have been scared to fess up? Think about it. If she brings light to who she is, what's the crowd going to do? Are they going to turn on her? Are they going to stone her? She just touched the whole crowd. They're all unclean because of her. There's a whole lot towards this coming forward moment, right? Sometimes coming forward to Jesus is going to be a scary thing, not because Jesus is scary, but the rest of the people that surround us in our lives may not be okay with it, right? It might alter the rest of the narrative around us. But she comes forward with her faith, confesses she was unclean, but when she touched him, she was clean. And then she tells her whole story. So think about that for a second. Why is it important that she told the whole truth, or she told her whole story? Why is that such an important part? Did Jesus already know her whole story? You bet. He knew her whole story. He knows your whole story. But he stops to hear it because she needs to tell it. She needs to tell it. Have you ever had somebody tell you a hard part of their story and you're like, this is the fourth time they've told me, but the truth is they need to tell it, because sometimes healing takes time and it takes a process and they're still working it out. It's like the dude who Jesus healed twice for being blind. He's like, okay. And the guy's like can half see, and then he finishes it off. Sometimes we have to tell our story to someone safe multiple times, because each time we tell it, we might learn it a little different and realize that God was there more and more, and establish that he was there and that he was in that story with us, even though we were broken and we couldn't see him. And so it's important to let people tell that whole story. That's because that's part of the healing process. Jesus wasn't done healing her. The healing wasn't over in that moment. There's a couple things he needed. Like, granted, she's not bleeding anymore, but she needs to tell her whole story so that she understands her absolute value, that God's going to stop for her. He's going to stop for her because she declared that he was absolute truth, and now he's declaring her absolute value. Isn't that beautiful? Do you see that? Because he stops for her. He doesn't keep going. He honestly could, if you think about it. He'd be like, on my way. She's going to show up in the crowd. She'll grab my tassel. She'll be healed. But I got to get off to Jairus' daughter, because Jairus is so important because he's a synagogue leader. No, he stops for her because her healing wasn't done. She needed to know her absolute value in that. But you know who also needed to see it? The stinking crowd. The crowd had to see that, because Jesus is, by giving her this time, he's declaring her clean and introducing her back into society, because that's another area of healing she needed. She needed that. So she needed to know that she was entering into a society that was going to be safer for her. And Jesus was just making sure that everybody needed to start to play nice with her, right? Because he calls her daughter. That's so cool. She's the only one who gets called daughter. And we have no idea how old this gal is. It's possible that she's older than Jesus. It's possible that she's older than him. And by him calling her daughter, he's declaring his deity in that. Isn't that super cool? I love that. But she needed to have someone who stopped for her. And Jesus had the time. He always has the time. Have you noticed that? I mean, we kind of are like, well, we are not God, and we're stuck to this whole 24-hour thing. But have you ever let God sidetrack you, and something took way more time than you realized, but somehow you miraculously got everything done anyways? Have you had that? I love those moments. It's like, sometimes I'm like, I just don't have time for this. But then all of a sudden, everything gets done. And you even sometimes get a little bit of spare extra time. And that's because he's the God of the universe, and he can handle all of that. And he's got the time. So he claims her right there. And so often, when we look at this story, we sit in our pews and we talk about the life of this woman, right? And we start to feel maybe sympathetic towards her, right? Go ahead and grab that next slide. And people always talk about the difference between, oh, that's really small. Can you guys read that? There's a difference between sympathy and empathy, right? And maybe you're familiar with it. People like to bring these things up a lot. But sympathy is feeling pity or sorrow and concern for someone, where empathy is feelings of understanding and acceptance. And so often we can sit here and hear a person's story, and we have sympathy for the situation. But the thing is that sympathy is always kind of like held out here at arm's length. Empathy is looking to have a connection with the person and relate to them. So often when we look at this story, when we start to dive on it, we're trying to connect with this lady so we have some empathy, not just a sympathy for her. And maybe you're like that during the week with the people you encounter. Some people are really good at sympathy because they like to have some kind of like little barrier there, and they don't want to really get involved. But then empathy calls for a little bit more, right? But then empathy, there's a third bank, a whole nother step to this, right? It's not just about understanding the person's experience and wanting to have connection with them, but there's one more step, and that's called compassion. And compassion is the action word. So empathy could be Jesus knowing that the gal is going to touch his cloak, be healed, and he'll catch up with her later, but he really has like a deep heart and wants to connect with her. But he's going to be on his way. Compassion is stopping and taking time with her. It's taking an action and then listening to her whole story so that that area of healing starts to happen. And then by declaring her daughter in the amongst the town, he's helping her re-enter society. She's going to go back to maybe not her old life, whatever her old life entailed, but definitely onto a new life, right? He is trying to heal her the whole way. So you can be empathetic, have empathy towards somebody, and have no compassion. Isn't that weird? It's true though. Empathy that takes action is now taking that whole next level of having compassion. And we need to be open to that. Like, what is God asking this next step to be? Now, maybe part of it is just you're to hear the story and stop for them. And then where you're at, pray for them. Have the boldness to do that. So can I pray for you? Can I pray for you right now? I'm trying to become bolder about that. But then also, if there's any other way in which God is asking you to take action, that's compassion. Sympathy kind of wishes them well and it's like, oh, that's too bad, but what can I do? That's what sympathy thinks. Empathy is like, oh my gosh, that just breaks my heart, you know? And then compassion is, so Lord, what are we doing with that? What are we doing with that? So go ahead and grab that next slide. Sometimes go means to stop. When God tells you, as you are going, make disciples, sometimes it means that you're going to have to like literally stop where you're at. Stop where you're at to be with people. And a lot of times be open to see where that goes. You never know where that's going to go. Have you ever had somebody who stopped for you? And because they stopped for you and they heard you out and they showed that they cared about what you had to say and they affirmed you where you needed it and they called you out where you needed it. When you think of your life, that encounter with that person changed the trajectory of your life. Have you had those conversations and those moments that like it shook you and you're like, I walked away from that and I couldn't forget it. And I made my decisions differently after that. And the direction of my life changed. Because someone stopped because they were in go mode. Are you ready to stop? Because you're in go mode. Go mode means sometimes we got to stop. And so that was where her deepest healing was. Her deepest healing was the fact that when he stopped for her, her absolute value was declared in the crowd. How beautiful is that? I love that. And she's terrified, only to realize that she'd never been safer. And so usually when we look at this story, we are looking at like how the woman was and how Jesus shows up in our lives in this way. But I want us to take a look today and be like, how is Jesus calling me to be like him in this story? Can I be like him in this story? Under his power and his strength, yes, you absolutely can. And granted, Jesus knows he's got all the time in the world. He knows that the 12-year-old girl is going to die and he's going to get on over there and raise her from the dead. Where, you know, she gets to the household and he's like, oh no, she's just sleeping. And then they laugh at him. Like, I'm like, oh my gosh, like in this story twice. If you've ever had people belittle you and laugh behind and snicker behind your back like you're an idiot, yeah, Jesus knows what that's like, right? It happens to him twice in this story. Like it happens to him twice. But Jesus, like, yes, granted, he knows that he is like, I'll get to her and raise her from the dead. It's going to be great, you know, because he knows, honestly, that little crowd is going to be more moved at the bringing back of this little girl than him showing up to do a healing. it was going to be a more powerful run with that crowd, because he already knows and honestly loves the crowd that was, giving him a hard time. He does. He knows their names. He loves them too. And they needed this. They needed this as well. So in this week, will you stop to be with people? You can grab that next slide. When somebody shows up, I mean, you run into people, or you know that you have time in your week that you should be intentional to go visit someone, right? Without thinking about it, ask this question: how valuable are they to me? Versus how valuable are they? Think about that for a second. Those are two totally different questions, absolutely different. You can grab that next slide. Because what we're really asking is, how am I and my time and resources more valuable than them? And what is fair for me to sacrifice for them? Like, without us realizing it, we gauge this question in our minds naturally. The reality is, right, that they have absolute value, and they are worth your time, and they are worth your resources, and they are not less valuable than you and your agenda. You know what I'm saying? And now you're probably going like, oh my gosh, this just makes me exhausted. But the reality is that there should be people who should be who should recognize this value in you too. Right? That we're all there to encourage one another as we care for one another, versus being worried about no one caring about us. Go care for other people. It's wild how they'll recognize and love back, right? So I have 3 times walked into Lowe's and was like, okay, got to grab a couple things and get out. And 3 times I've walked into Lowe's, not grabbed anything off the shelf yet, ran into somebody in an aisle that I knew, that I hadn't seen in a while, and we stood there and talked. And I, as we know, always have a lot to say. Of course I do. I know. I have the gift of gab. I love to chat with people. I love to engage with people. But I ran into people where they just really had a lot to say. And they were going through a lot of things. And we stood there in the aisle of Lowe's. I'll say 4 times. One time it was a person who worked at Lowe's. It was some lady. I asked her where something was, and then she somehow just turned into telling me like her whole life story. It's crazy. And I wasn't bothered by it, but my brain had for a second, like, I have an agenda and a shopping list, kind of a thing. And then I stopped for a second. I'm like, they're so much more valuable than the sticker price of the things I have to pick up and the projects I'm about to go do with all the things, right? And I can come back in the morning, can't I? So in each of those cases, I stood in the aisle, hung out with the person, listened to their whole story. And then when they moved on to do their shopping, I was actually out of time, and I just had to go put my cart away, and I left the store. I didn't get any of my shopping done. But I know that somehow God is going to make time for me to get back to Lowe's to get the items. And every time he worked that one out, you know what I mean? Like, I was actually in Lowe's for a better purpose than I thought. It's wild how God has something else to do with you if we're open to it. And I think, how many times was I just, I avoided those moments because I was with my cart and I was on a mission and I was buying things and I was getting out, and I was not going to stop and talk to anybody. May you have a week that you can stop, even if you're on your way to go heal a 12-year-old girl. Like, that's a pretty important thing Jesus was on his way to do. But don't be afraid to stop. Don't be afraid to see what God's going to do with that. because sometimes going means stopping. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you that you are one who stops for us. God, you've stopped for us so many times, even in the week. And we're not even aware that you're just asking us to tell you our whole story. And you already know it, but you still want to hear it from us. And so, Lord, may our prayer life take this whole other crazy spin this week, that we tell our whole story. We tell what we're processing, that we just tell you it and not just think about how we already know you know it. Because God, what you really want is that relationship. And so, Lord, may we also be then open to be that in the places where you're calling us to be. May we not be questioning the value of people versus our time and our plans and our agenda and our own things. Lord, may we realize that you are God who can replenish the time and who provides in all of the other ways. And that we start to see that the people in our lives are the things of great and absolute value. And so, Lord, may we live this week in a new way and come back with so many cool stories of encounters we've had. We love you. We thank you in your precious name. Amen.